And I'm going to have to record on my personal computer as well because, as you probably know, the church computer has a lot to be desired, leaves a lot to be desired. So someone passed it on to the tech committee that we could use another one. Okay, and then I'm just going to share, if I can remember how to do that. Okay, perfect. But we don't need to share God's law, right? Okay, is everyone ready? Everyone turn to Genesis chapter 22. So it's been a couple of weeks because I was Amy and I were not here last week. But the other week we left off toward the end of Genesis chapter 21, and we didn't quite get to the end. But I'm going to go ahead and have us skip to Genesis chapter 22 because it's a very, very important chapter. You might remember me saying that when you go through the Bible and when you go through a particular book of the Bible, including a book like Genesis, you're going to run into several landmarks. Do you remember me saying that? When you travel to Chicago, you know that you're getting closer and closer by the mile markers, right? But every now and again, you'll encounter a city or town like Effingham, my old stomping grounds in Mattoon, Champaign, and you know that you're getting closer to the end. And I talked about how the book of Genesis also has mile markers or landmarks. Genesis chapter 3 is what I call the plot of the entire Bible. Genesis chapter 12 is when God calls Abraham. Genesis 15 is when God makes a covenant with Abraham. And Genesis 17 is when God finally gives Abraham a son. And so, 20 is that right? Anyway, Genesis 22 is also one of those landmarks. And it's actually, you can think of it as the climax and the climax and the close and culmination of Abraham's story. Now, before I go on, I'm going to try to remember how to hide this panel. There you go. See, I'm a good millennial after all. All right. Now, this chapter is famously known as the binding of Isaac. In Hebrew, the word is Akedah for binding. And on the left there, you could see one of the most famous paintings in the world, a painting by, I believe it's by Rembrandt. And I might have gotten that completely wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's by Rembrandt. But it's just an artist's rendition of Genesis chapter 22, Abraham getting ready to sacrifice his only son, Isaac. And of course, if you're a parent, a mom or a dad, you know this is every parent's worst nightmare. I think a few sermons ago, I talked about how I watched one of the newest Marvel movies, Fantastic Four, the new Fantastic Four movie. Has anyone seen that movie yet? I'm asking the wrong crowd for that, I guess. Well, I'll make it short. Part of that movie is two of the main characters. They have a infant son. They give birth to a son, and most of the movie is basically trying to protect that son because this giant, I don't know what you call him, alien, cosmic alien, is basically wanting them to give up their son. In exchange, he won't destroy the earth. Not that that's important, but basically what I'm getting at is when I was watching that movie in theaters, I noticed that I was a lot more invested in that movie than I would have been a couple years ago before we had Aaron, because now I know what it's like to have to be a father and to have a child, right? So this is every dad's worst nightmare. But I say that it brings Abraham's story to a close and a climax and kind of brings it full circle because remember all the way back in Genesis chapter 12, one of the major landmarks of not only the book of Genesis, but the whole Bible. Genesis chapter 12 is one of the big turning points of the Bible. God calls Abraham and his family to be a blessing to the world, right? because this is right after the Tower of Babel or Babel. And Genesis chapters 3 through 11, as I said, is the spiraling down of human history and human society. And out of the mess of humanity, God calls out Abraham and Abraham's family to be a blessing to the world. And we got someone joining us. Perfect. It brings Abraham's story full circle, because although they've had Isaac at this point, all of a sudden, plot twist, God seems to ask Abraham to give up his son, the very son that, in a way, is the hope of the world. And the reason that it's personal, it brings Abraham's personal story arc to a close, is because Abraham has proven to be a pretty good guy, but also a very flawed character, right? Are you with me? He throws his wife under the bus, not just once, but twice, 2 separate times, years apart. He's failed to trust God several times. So Abraham's story is kind of up and down. And yet this is the man that we refer to as the father of our faith, or the father of faith, period. So this chapter brings Abraham's story arc to a close, because Abraham, spoiler alert, finally shows himself to be the faithful partner that God has been looking for. If you look at my 4th point, after the failures of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and his family, and even his cousin Lot, the question is, will Abraham finally be the human partner that God is looking for? And the short answer is yes and no. No, because ultimately we're still waiting for the ultimate Messiah, right, in Jesus Christ. But yes, in that Abraham proves himself to be faithful, even if it's relatively faithful. And because of that, he gives birth to Isaac, who gives birth to Jacob, who gives birth to 12 sons, who eventually become the people of Israel, who gives birth to our Messiah, right? And this solidifies Abraham's status as the father of faith. Okay, next slide, if it'll let me. So the question of this story is, how does Abraham react when he encounters threats and obstacles to the fulfillment of the promise, including the promise of seed or descendants? So far, his track record is kind of mixed. But in this story, Abraham will prove himself faithful. So, okay, I'll get to that in a little bit. First of all, there's supposed to be a video here, so I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, we're going to watch this short video from the Bible Project, and before I do that, I think so Beth Ann and others in the future are able to hear. I think I need to change the settings so that the sound settings. So bear with me a little bit. Hear computer sound. Stereo. Oh no, don't go. Okay, that should work. All right, cross your fingers. All right. All right, we're gonna watch a short video, and then if you have any questions, we'll just have some time to talk about it.
The story of the Bible begins with God creating a beautiful world and then sharing it with all of his creatures.
And he appoints Adam and Eve to rule it on his behalf.
And God gives them access to his wisdom and life, but then tells them that there's one tree they can't eat from because it will lead to death.
So they have a choice about how to rule with God. This kind of feels like a test.
Well, that's because it is a test.
But isn't that kind of cruel for God to test them?
Well, not all tests are bad. Let's say there's a king who chooses you to fulfill a royal task because he wants to know if you are trustworthy.
Well, I guess that's a test, but really it's an opportunity to do something important and noble.
Right, but then let's say there's a rebel who hates the king and you. And he tries to convince you that you would be better off not doing what the king asks.
Well, the rebel is setting a trap.
Right, so a test could be an opportunity or a trap. And the difference is whether the one testing you has your best interests in mind.
I see. And both types of tests appear in the beginning of the Bible. God tells them to eat of the tree of life and not the forbidden tree.
Yeah, this is God's test of loyalty. God wants to rule the world with humans as his partners, which means they will need to trust his wisdom over their own.
But then a rebel comes and tests them to eat of that other tree.
Right, the rebel seizes this opportunity and twists it, so he can lead the humans into exile and ultimately death.
He turns the test into a trap.
But after the humans fail, God promises that one day a human will come who will pass the test and defeat the snake. And as the story moves on, God gives a couple named Abraham and Sarah an opportunity to trust him by leaving their family behind, to go to a new land where God will use them to restore his blessing to all people.
So this is a test.
And at first, things go well. But Abraham quickly fails. He lies to protect himself, and then he and Sarah scheme to get a son their own way by abusing one of their servants.
Definitely not passing the test.
But God doesn't give up on Abraham. He gives him one final opportunity, a test to prove his loyalty. God asks Abraham to go up onto a hill and offer his son as a sacrifice.
I can't imagine a more intense test.
And Abraham does it. But in the last moment, God stops him and provides a substitute animal in the place of his son. God then says he will fulfill his promise through Abraham's family because he passed this test.
So Abraham passed this test, but he hasn't proven to be a fully trustworthy partner. We're still waiting for someone who can pass the ultimate test.
Yeah, and as the family of Abraham grows and becomes a nation, God continues to test them.
Like when the Israelites wander in the wilderness for 40 years.
They have lots of opportunities to trust in God, to provide water or daily bread.
But they instead blame God and even say that he trapped them in the desert to kill them.
And so the rest of Israel's story in the Hebrew scriptures is pretty much the same. The Israelites don't trust in God and his promise. They're not loyal, and eventually the whole nation fails.
So humans have an amazing opportunity to partner with God, but no one is really qualified.
And so all of this brings us forward to Jesus. There's a story where Jesus goes into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights without food or water.
Ah, yes, the wilderness. And there, he meets a sinister creature who tries to trap him.
But Jesus trusts in God's wisdom.
And he passes the test.
Then later there's a story about Jesus going to pray with some friends, and God commissions him to go up to Jerusalem and to give up his life.
And so he goes. And on the night of his arrest, Jesus took his friends and went to a garden.
And he told them to pray, because tonight, he said, is the great test.
And he prayed to God, please let this test pass from me, but not my desire, rather may your desire be done.
In this garden, Jesus shows us what passing the test looks like. He trusted in God's wisdom, he loved others more than himself, and he confronted evil with good.
Even though it cost him his life.
Right. Jesus offered his own life as a sacrifice to cover for all of the failed tests of his people Israel and of all humanity. Jesus passed the ultimate test on behalf of us all.
This is amazing. But that doesn't mean everything is gonna be great in our lives. I mean, let's be honest, we're gonna face our own tests every day.
Right. Jesus said every generation of his followers would have their own tests that will force them to trust God in radical new ways.
And these tests can be difficult and often painful.
But remember, a test from a good God is an opportunity. This is why James, a leader in the early Jesus movement, said that we should be grateful when we face tests and trials because they offer us a gift. It's an opportunity to surrender to God's wisdom and to become more like Jesus, the one who loved us and who passed the test on our behalf.
All right, any questions or comments? once again, I just want to recommend the Bible Project to you. You can find it on YouTube, and hopefully, you see every video shows you or tries to show you what I've tried to communicate from day one, which is the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation is one long story that ultimately leads to Jesus. It's not just series of random disconnected stories. It's really one long story or series that points to Jesus, and that's what Jesus said that the whole Old Testament was. Okay, let's go ahead and do a deep dive into Genesis chapter 22, and we have a lot to go through. So we're going to spend a couple weeks in it. We're not going to get through all of it all in this week. I mean, we could try, I guess, but I could tell you right now we're not going to do it. But we're going to let's go ahead and start with Genesis chapter 22, and we're going to read through verses 1 through 5. So assuming everyone's there, Dwayne, can I volunteer you to read verses 1 through 5?
Yes.
Okay.
After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you.
Okay. So just a couple things before we move on to the rest of the chapter. Like I said, this is every father's worst nightmare. And the Bible doesn't tell us what Abraham is thinking or feeling, but I can't imagine that Abraham would feel anything other than grief or related emotions, right? Once again, if you're a parent, you can imagine. Now, a couple of observations, a couple things I want to note is that Isaac was most likely a teenager at this point in time. Okay, so he wasn't a little boy anymore. And when God refers to him as your only son, you might be thinking, well, what about Ishmael? And the long story short is that, remember, about a couple chapters ago, Abraham had cut off ties with Ishmael and Hagar, and that made Isaac legally his only living heir and legitimate son. A lot of how they thought back in that day was in terms of inheritance and etc. Now, God does say it is, and in addition, God specifically told Abraham and Sarah that it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, right? So, so there's a tension here. Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and read through the rest of this chapter, and we're going to do what we often do, which is we're going to go around in a circle. We'll go counterclockwise this time. And Jenny, do you feel okay with picking up where Dwayne left off and just reading through the? We'll read through. Let's see. Read through verse 19, or whoever ends. Read through verse 19. We'll stop at verse 19. Okay.
So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering? God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told them to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar atop the wood. Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am.
And he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not held your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Abraham called the name of the place, the Lord will provide, as it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. 15.
The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time. He said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this, and you have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of your enemies. And through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me. Then Abraham returned to his servants, and they set off together for Beersheba. And Abraham stayed in Beersheba.
Okay. So, as I say, every parent's worst nightmare. But in traditional cultures like the ancient Middle East, the ancient Near East, as Bible scholars put it, the future survival and economic well-being of your family and your descendants was placed on the child. So all the parents' hopes and dreams for the future, for their family line, it was placed all on the child, particularly the firstborn. And if it was an only child, that was a big deal, because if they died, then your family had no future ahead of it, right? And in that culture, that culture, having a child or children, in fact, having as many children as you could, was a big deal. It was like being rich in their eyes, and it was a symbol of social status, right? It was, like how we prize getting a lot of money. People did back then as well, but they really prized having children and having a lot of children and having as many children as they could. And like I said earlier, in Isaac, the fate of the world is kind of at stake, right? It's hanging in the balance because God promised to bless the world through Isaac and his family. And the implication is that by blessing the world through Abraham and Isaac and their family, it would kind of counteract the curse. The blessing would counteract the curse of sin that had spread into the world through human beings. Now, this chapter might be disturbing to you, and for good reason. It should be, right? The Bible doesn't hide it. In fact, the Mosaic law later on in Leviticus and again in Deuteronomy strictly forbade human sacrifices, let alone child sacrifices, which the original readers of Genesis would know as ancient Israelites and ancient Jews. So this command by God would shock them and would seem completely out of character for him. Reading, of course, they know that it's a test because it says that it was a test, but it would still shock them and seem kind of out of place, out of character. But Abraham had no way of knowing any of that at this point in history, right? This is hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000 years before the Mosaic law. And at Abraham's point in time, and even during the time of the nation of Israel, child sacrifice was relatively common in those cultures around them. And so Abraham could have assumed that God was being just like some of the other gods that demanded child sacrifice. This is what one Bible scholar, John Walton, whom I'll be referring to a lot today, this is what he had to say. In the ancient Near East, the god that provided fertility, El, is also entitled to demand a portion of what has been produced. This is expressed in the sacrifice of animals, grain, and children. So there was a Canaanite god El that they often practiced human sacrifice to. Now, even though God had strictly forbidden Israel and the people of Israel to participate in child sacrifice, even in ancient Israel, the firstborn was dedicated to Yahweh, right? They recognized that children were a gift, and life in general was a gift. Remember in Genesis chapter 2, you have God breathing the breath of life into Adam. And so anything that is living and breathing, their life comes from God. We owe God our lives. And this is especially true for Isaac, because Isaac was definitely a gift from God, right? Abraham and Sarah had no business in their age having a child. And so God had gifted them a gift in a son. And traditional cultures had a stronger view of what we might call corporate responsibility. And what I mean by that is it would not be uncommon for a family member to bear the punishment for another family member or for their family as a whole. So really quick, if you know of the story of Achan in the book of Joshua, in Hebrew it's pronounced Achan, but anyway, so the people of Israel go through one of the Philistine towns, right? And they were specifically told by God to not take any of the loot, to not be like any of the other empires that do that type of thing, because they're not in it for the gold and the silver and whatever. But Achan helps himself to a little bit of the gold, right, or the treasure or whatever. And because of that, the people of Israel suffered, and they find out that he had stashed some of the treasure in his tent or in his home. And when they find that out, the whole family is executed. And that might sound really intense and unfair. And to this day, I still kind of have a problem with that. But that was ancient societies and traditional societies' idea of corporate responsibility. In some way, you are responsible for your family or for community and for the actions of your family. And so where I'm going with this is Abraham may have wondered if God, having given Isaac as a gift, right? Remember? He might have wondered if God was calling in the debt, so to speak. You with me? He might have, when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, his mind may have been racing and thinking of to all the things that he could have done that might have that he might have done wrong, that could have earned this for him, that might have deserved this for him. And yeah, go ahead.
Can I interject something here?
Yeah.
A commentary that I studied on this a long time ago. The author, as he considered Abraham in this testing, speculated or led us to consider the idea that in this pagan land where child sacrifice was common, Abraham, as God's child, in his devotional life, was wondering this: do I love or consider my child in the same way? But others are doing this, even though they're pagans.
Mm-hmm.
Do I love my God as much as they do?
Mm. Yeah. Well, and I do think that was part of the test.
And it doesn't have to do with calling in the dead, but it has to do with the mindset of Abraham.
Yeah.
And this particular scholar was a Southern Baptist scholar and got into all kinds of trouble for suggesting among Southern Baptists. But to me, it sounds like a pretty reasonable idea. In our devotional life, do we sometimes consider am I devoted to God as much as those heathens around me are devoted to the things that they do?
Yeah. Well, and I do think that was part of the test, which is where I'm going with that. John Moulton, once again, who's a professor at Wheaton College, he says God does not really intend for Abraham to make the sacrifice. His purpose is to see what Abraham is prepared to give up. And the way that I want to frame it is, a lot of times you and I, well, most people here are older than me, so I don't need to tell you this, but you know, if you've gone through any, if you've gone through life, you know at some point, most people will ask themselves, probably you have asked yourself at some point, is God good? Is God a good God? And can I trust him? Can I trust him? Maybe because of something that's happened in your life, maybe because of something that's happened in other people's lives, maybe because of something that's happened in the world, you know, like when 9/11 happened, or the hurricane that's going on, you know, in the Caribbean, right? Is God a good God, and can I trust him? And I think the test for Abraham was multifaceted, right? Multidimensional. But I think a big part of that was God was prodding and pushing Abraham to see if Abraham will finally trust him with his life, right? Because remember, once again, Abraham threw Sarah, his wife, under the bus twice, not once, but twice, to save his own skin, because he didn't trust God enough that he would protect him and that they would have a child, etc. How does Abraham do with this test? He does pretty good, actually. Notice that in verse 5, it says that he said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and then we will come back." So Abraham has every intention and has the idea that somehow both he and Isaac will come back to them. And then in verse 8, when Isaac asks him where the sacrifice is, Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." Okay, so Abraham says that he'll be back, you know, and then I have the Arnold Schwarzenegger from the Terminator clip there saying he'll be back, and then he says God himself will provide the lamb, and then he'll provide the sacrifice. And then you fast forward to the New Testament, and then the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11:17-19, by faith Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Now, my question was, how does Abraham do with the test of faith? He does pretty good, but the next question is how does he have that faith? And why does he have that faith? And I want us to go back several chapters earlier, back to Genesis 15. Will you turn there with me? Genesis 15. And hopefully this will be a familiar passage to most of you.
While you're doing that, I want to say something or two.
Yeah.
The fourth verse I thought was an important too. Just read it, look at the first few words in it. It says, "On the third day."
Yeah.
Where have we heard that?
Yeah, you're getting ahead of me, Dwayne.
Oh, did I? I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. I'm glad you pointed that out. Okay, can I have a volunteer read? Let's see. Can I need two volunteers. I need someone to read verses 4-6, and then another to read verses 9 and 10. Any takers? Bill, do you want to read verses 4-6?
And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir." Then he brought him outside and said, look now toward heaven and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness.
Okay. But why don't you go ahead and read verses 9 and 10 again?
Oh, 9 and 10.
Yeah, 9 and 10.
So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two, down the middle. He placed each piece opposite the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when the vultures came down with carcasses, Abraham threw them away.
Okay, that's good. So in verses 4 through 6, God promises Abraham, look up at the sky and count the stars. So shall your offspring be. And it says that Abraham believed God and he credited to him as righteousness. And then God calls him to take animals, to slaughter them, and to arrange them in halves opposite of each other with some space in between. It's been several weeks now. Can anyone remind me what is going on?
Is that
Covenant.
Yes. Okay. Dwayne, say more about that.
Oh, okay. Well, if there's two people and they're both equal,
Mhm.
and they make some kind of pledge to each other to do that covenant, they split an animal in half, and both of them walk down through the center,
Mhm.
and that ensures of the covenant. Okay, but in this case here, Abraham didn't walk down the center. He was in a trance, and only God walked down, because Abraham and God were not, first of all, not equal.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
that covenant was strictly from God.
Yeah. It's unilateral, as some people put it. Mike, do you have anything to add to
No,
that?
I was gonna go with what you said.
Yeah.
That God was the only one that walked through and took if the covenant was broken, it would be back on him instead of Abraham.
Yeah. For those of you that don't remember what Mike or Dwayne are talking about, basically, just to try to make it as clear as possible, the animals being cut in half symbolize, if I go back on my end of the covenant, may I end up like these animals, right? May I be torn to pieces. And the person that was making that oath, that vow, walked between the pieces to make that vow. May I be torn to pieces if I'm not faithful to my end of the covenant. And typically, like what Dwayne said, if both two parties were equal, they both walked through, or if it was a lord and a servant or a vassal, usually the lower social status person would walk through, but the lord would never walk through the pieces, right? However, and I'll go ahead and skip to verses 17 and 18. Dwayne gave us a spoiler alert. It says in verse 17 and 18, when the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. And it says, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. So, as Dwayne and Mike said, God himself, in the form of fire, which he would often appear as in the Old Testament, God himself walked between the pieces, remember? And in effect saying, Abraham, if I'm not faithful to my end of the covenant, may I be torn to pieces. But it wasn't just amazing that the immortal God himself walked between the pieces. What was also amazing was that, once again, as Dwayne said, God never called Abraham to walk between the pieces. In other words, God was making the promise for both of them. He was saying, Abraham, if I'm not faithful to my end of the covenant, may I be torn to pieces. But also, if you're not faithful to your end of the covenant, may I be torn to pieces. And so, how does this relate back to Genesis chapter 22? How could Abraham have had such strong faith in God that he would be true to his word? After going through all the things in his mind that he could have done wrong to have deserved this, throwing his life under the bus in Egypt, throwing his life under the bus with Abimelech and the Philistines, he must have remembered God's unilateral promise to be faithful no matter what, whether he was unfaithful or Abraham was unfaithful, you know. Granted, Abraham messed up between Genesis 15 and now too, but since then, God had only proven to be faithful time and time again, even though Abraham had proven to be unfaithful a lot of times. And sure enough, they ended up having Isaac. And now, it should come as no surprise, right, that this ultimately prefigures who? Jesus, right? Our Lord and our Messiah, because the Bible said, the New Testament says that we are saved by grace alone through faith alone. I preached about it on Sunday. How can we be sure? How can we have faith and trust in God despite of our own sin and our own unfaithfulness? Because he walked between the pieces for you and me, right? He says, I will be faithful to you, even if you are unfaithful, even if you fail to uphold your end of the covenant, right? And I think you see this when going back to the passage that we started with, Genesis chapter 22. In verse 2, it says, "Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah." Can anyone tell me what the significance of Moriah is?
That's just about her question.
Very close, because, yes, Bill, you're right, because Mount Moriah is better known by its future name, Mount Zion, which of course is the future location of the temple. And the temple, of course, is where the sacrifices were made in Jerusalem, right? And we know that although Jesus wasn't sacrificed at the temple, he is the ultimate temple. In fact, in John chapter 2, and in some of the other gospels too, when the Pharisees ask him, Jesus, what sign are you going to give us to prove what you're saying is true? Jesus responds by saying, destroy this temple and it will be raised again in 3 days, right? And John says that the temple he was talking about was, as in scripture, 2 Chronicles 3:1, that Solomon began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And Abraham called that place the Lord will provide, and to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. Now, most Bible scholars, or at least many Bible scholars, believe that the final edition of Genesis, because we believe that Genesis was likely written by Moses, right? But most Bible scholars believe that the final edition, because there were editors too that were involved in the process, the final edition took place probably around the time of the Babylonian exile. And so by that time, the mountain of the Lord in Jerusalem, Mount Zion, had previously been established, and the people in exile in Babylon were looking for hope that it would be reestablished again. And so when the book of Genesis says, on the mountain of the Lord, it will be provided, what they're talking specifically about is that on Mount Zion, they were looking for the hope of a future temple. And eventually, the future temple did come, but it didn't come in the way that they thought it would. It came in the form like Isaac was Abraham's beloved son. When Jesus was baptized, God the Father said, "You are my son whom I love. With you I am well pleased." And of course, we all know the most famous Bible verse in our culture and society, at least. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, in the King James, only begotten son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And, to go back to my original question, many times in life we will ask, is God a good God? And how can I trust him? And as I've put it before, any God that is willing to become human to die for me has earned my trust. And this is how Paul puts it in Romans chapter 8, verses 31, 32, 38, and 39. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither present nor future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop there for tonight. But I want to hear from you if you have any questions, comments, observations, or witty jokes. So what do you have for me? Any questions or comments or observations? Carla?
I just never saw Isaac and boy, as being just a young boy. I never saw him as a teenager until tonight. And I thought, well, he did obey his father. That he was willing to do what his father asked of him.
Yes, and
But I always saw that it was a younger child that would just do what his father asked.
yeah, a lot of Bible scholars, a lot of Old Testament scholars will point out that there's no record or sign of any struggle, which meant that Isaac also displayed faith somehow, right? Because he probably knew how old his mother and father were, right? So he probably knew that he himself was a miracle. So he was part of it. And likewise, Jesus says in the gospel of, oh man, I think it's the gospel. He says in one of the gospels, no one takes my life. I lay it down on my own. Because the Father and the Son are of the same will. They're of the same heart. They're of the same mind, right? Because the Son's love is the Father's love, and the Father's love is the Son's love.
Can you imagine doing that today? Here you go, teenagers, lay down, let me tie up, lay you on this altar, it'll be okay.
Hey, but I was thinking through this story from a human perspective, just wondering, thought was crossing my mind. I wondered what Abraham said to Sarah, if anything.
Or yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking. I know
He was talking about
all of you know my wife, and I got a feeling that if I said, well, you know, I'm going to take Logan and we're going to go off, probably I'm going to have to kill him. It may not go real well for me. So
You almost become a sacrifice.
But anyway, it was, you know.
all the stories in the Bible, which are lessons, every one of them, humanize God, which we need every day to see God as part of life. In our life, you have something greater than God. But to realize sacrifices that were made in love of God, what would you do? But I always think too, what would Jesus do? I mean, that's one of my favorite questions to ask myself when I question anything is, what would Jesus do?
That's always a good question to ask ourselves, I think.
Somewhere I seen they said that Isaac was like 37.
Oh, my, don't.
I've heard that Isaac may have been an adult. I've never heard 37.
They said 30. I can't remember where I seen it, but it said 37, and I forget the significance.
I don't think he would have been that old because Dwayne, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think it does say how old. Well, I guess I could look it up just now, but I think it does say how old Abraham and Sarah were when they died, and I don't think
Sarah was 120 was.
Oh well, okay.
They were born.
So Isaac was born, I believe, when Sarah was 90.
Right. Abraham wasn't.
Right, and Isaac would have been 37 when Sarah died, but I don't think
Okay.
that was the same year as
Well, they always show, I mean, all the pictures show him as a young boy and all the paintings or whatever. And they said it wasn't necessarily a toddler or not maybe a toddler, but.
No, he was a teenager or possibly like a young man. So,
Well, less than just Todd was the father was willing to give up his son. If Christ wanted, if God.
You know, Abraham had, God had promised Abraham that it would be through Isaac that all this would happen.
yeah.
So I think Abraham might have thought, well, if I do kill him, God will bring him right back.
Well, that's what Hebrews says, right? That Abraham reasoned, I think, is kind of the word that they use. That he
You know, he said this is going to happen, or he's going to be my heir, my only heir. So if he dies, God's going to bring him back.
Yeah, well, and that was my whole point. I think God or Abraham must have remembered how God once again walked between the pieces, and he trusts the point. I think the moral of the story, the lesson of the story, is that he trusted God that he would be faithful to his promise, whether it was bringing him back or providing, a sacrifice, or maybe even dying himself, which eventually he does, right, in the form of his son Jesus. So, yeah.
Seems to me like a lot of the things that Abraham says during this whole event, seems to me he's saying what he hopes will happen, not what he actually believes. Yeah, I do this, but I sure do hope don't have to.
Yeah. Actually, sorry, Dwayne.
No, that's all.
Oh, okay. Well, there was a Danish theologian, Soren Kierkegaard, right, who wrote about the binding of Isaac, and he was the one that coined the term a leap of faith. That comes from the 1800s, from this Danish theologian he was a Lutheran theologian named Soren Kierkegaard, and he wrote a whole book on how to Abraham, the whole thing must have seemed absurd to him, because he knew that God was asking him to sacrifice his son, but he also knew equally that God had promised him, literally swore on his life, right, that Isaac would be the offspring that would be the source of the blessing. So the Soren Kierkegaard said that the leap of faith for Abraham was holding both truths in tension, that he was to be obedient to God, and yet God would somehow be faithful to him, that somehow they would come on the other side okay, and he had no idea what that would look like. For him, it must have felt like a leap in the dark. And sometimes following God can feel like that, right? And isn't that a kind of a parable for like the Christian life, and for Abraham's story, God tells him, hey, go to the place I will show you, right? When he tells him in Genesis 12 to leave his family, and Abraham says where, and God says, I'll show you later, let's go. And he says, I'm going to give you a son. Abraham says, how? And God says, I'll show you later, just trust me. And then he says, I want you to put your son to death. And Abraham says, why? And God says, I'll tell you later, just climb up the mountain. And I'm getting this from my favorite preacher, Tim Keller. He says, that's what Christianity is. That's what following Jesus is all about. It's constantly one foot in front of the other, sometimes in this dark world, not knowing where we're going, but trusting that you'll come out the other side with God.
Mr. Google said, Jewish tradition says that Isaac was 25.
There you go. I would be curious myself actually to find out where, because I'm with Carla. I remember growing up in church, everyone thinking that Isaac was a little boy, right? Did everyone else have that experience?
I was a Methodist at that time.
Yeah.
No one's perfect.
I know, I became a Baptist. But I've never even, in my mind, I see Isaac laying there, he's a boy about 7 or 8 years old. And that's my vision of what that story tells.
Mhm.
It makes it even more traumatic to think he was older than that
Mm.
and was willing to do just what his father asked of him.
I think that image pulls on our hearts, and it's gonna be a lot harder to kill a child from nature.
I mean, let's be honest, sometimes you want to kill your teenager, right?
You know, with Abraham also, how long has he been wandering around there? God says, go and I'll show you what for. When are we gonna get there? Have you heard that before? Are we there yet?
All right, anyone else? Let me give you just a sneak preview of what we're going to study next week. We're going to talk about why does God test Abraham? Why does God test Abraham? And why does he test you and me? What's the point of these tests? You know, the video alluded to it, so we got a glimpse of that, but we're going to do a deep dive on it. Why did God test Abraham in the first place? What's up with that? And then, skipping a little bit ahead in my notes, we're going to talk about James references this episode in the life of Abraham. And he says famously, faith without works is dead, or in this version, faith without deeds is dead. Doesn't that contradict the Apostle Paul, you know, that we're saved by grace alone through faith alone? And I'll give you just a little bit of a spoiler alert. Long story short, no, it doesn't. They're talking, well, I don't want to give too much away, but basically, here's how I'm going to put it. We're saved by faith alone, but not by a faith that remains. Okay? True faith will always manifest itself in works. And another way I put it before,
I think it says faith by works is dead.
Yes, faith by works is dead. And another way I put it is faith without works is not true saving faith. Okay? And Ephesians 2:8-10 basically tells us we're not saved by our good works, but we are saved for good works, right? So stay tuned. We're going to do a deep dive on Paul and James. They don't contradict each other. They're actually complementary. So, okay. Can I have a volunteer say a quick prayer, and then we'll end for tonight?
Jim will.
Jim, thank you so much for volunteering.
I'll do it. Our dear Heavenly Father, dear Lord, thank you for this night, so that we may be able to discuss these things about Jesus and his family and the episodes that we will be studying in the future. We thank you for this time to get together, and thank you for this country. These things I say in your very precious name. Amen.
Thank you, Jim.
And except for Mike Fields and Dwayne Fields, we're gonna put tables up, and because we're kind of playing with 12 8-foot tables, let's not put any